The tapes were running again. It is the spring of 1968, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, the man who had passed more domestic legislation than any president since Roosevelt, who had signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and Medicare and Medicaid and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act into law, who had dreamed of a great society and had the congressional muscle to build it, is on the telephone at 2 in the morning, and he cannot sleep, and he is listening to the war. Not briefings, not summaries. He had arranged with a particular and revealing obsessiveness to receive the names of the dead each morning. Every American killed in Vietnam the previous day. He read the names, he kept them. Those who worked close to him described a man who was being consumed from the inside by a war he had inherited, escalated, justified, and could neither win nor leave. By the beginning of 1968, there were 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. The number had been 16,000 when he took office after Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. The escalation had been his. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, the ground troops, the search and destroy missions, the body counts that his generals delivered with a confidence that the actual situation in the field consistently refused to justify. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had built a quantitative architecture around the war: metrics, ratios, kill counts, pacification indices, that gave the management of it the appearance of science while the reality was something no spreadsheet had a column for. Johnson had been told repeatedly by people whose judgment he trusted and by people whose judgment he had stopped trusting precisely because of what they were telling him, that the war was not going the way the public presentation suggested. He had pressed his generals. He had asked bluntly whether they could win. They had told him yes. He had believed them because the alternative, that the United States, the most powerful military force in the history of the world, could not defeat a guerrilla insurgency in a country the size of California, was a conclusion that had consequences he could not yet look at directly. Then came January 31st, 1968. The Tet Offensive began on the Vietnamese New Year during a holiday ceasefire that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had announced they would observe and then did not observe, launching coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. They attacked the American embassy in Saigon. They attacked Hue, the ancient imperial city, and held it for weeks in fighting that was medieval in its intimacy and brutality. They attacked provincial capitals that had been described in official briefings as secured. The military result was, in the narrow tactical sense, an American and South Vietnamese victory. The Tet Offensive was beaten back. The Viet Cong suffered catastrophic losses from which they arguably never fully recovered as a fighting force. The North Vietnamese had gambled on a popular uprising in the South that did not materialize. None of that was what the country saw. The country saw the embassy. The country saw Eddie Adams's photograph of a South Vietnamese general executing a Viet Cong prisoner in the street. A single frame that became one of the most reproduced images of the century, that won the Pulitzer Prize, and that its subject, Adams, spent the rest of his life feeling complicated about because of what it had done and what it had omitted. The country saw Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America by the polling of that era, return from Vietnam and deliver on February 27th a television editorial saying the war was a stalemate and that the only rational way out was negotiation. Johnson watched it in the White House and said to the people in the room that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. He was right, but the problem was deeper than public opinion. The problem was the money. The war was costing, by early 1968, approximately $2 billion a month. Johnson had refused for years to ask Congress for a war tax, because asking for a war tax meant choosing between the war and the Great Society, and he had refused to choose. He had insisted, against the advice of his economic advisors, that the American economy was large enough to finance both guns and butter simultaneously, that the richest country on earth could build Medicaid and Medicare and fund the poverty programs and the education programs and the housing programs, and still pay for Vietnam without the brutal fiscal discipline that a wartime tax would impose. He had been wrong. Inflation was accelerating. The budget deficit was widening. The gold reserves were under pressure. The international monetary system that had been constructed at Bretton Woods after the Second World War was developing cracks that would, within a few years, cause it to collapse entirely. And his party was fracturing. Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota with a dry wit and genuine moral seriousness about the war, had entered the Democratic primary against a sitting president. Something that was not done, that was understood to be politically futile, that was the act of a man making a point rather than a campaign. In the New Hampshire primary in March, McCarthy won 42% of the vote against an incumbent president. Johnson won, technically, but 42% against a sitting president in your own party's primary in the first contest of the election year was not a victory. It was a diagnosis. 4 days later, Robert Kennedy entered the race. Johnson and Kennedy, the two men, the two names, the weight of the relationship between them, which was one of the more consequential and mutually corrosive rivalries in American political history. This development landed in the White House with a specific gravity. Kennedy had the name. He had the constituency. He had the moral authority on the war that Johnson, who had escalated it, could not credibly claim. Johnson's advisors began to run the numbers, and the numbers were not encouraging. He convened in mid-March a group that became known as the Wise Men. Former secretaries of state and defense, former national security advisors, the foreign policy establishment of the post-war era, men like Dean Acheson and McGeorge Bundy, who had built the architecture of American Cold War policy and who had, in an earlier meeting, counseled him to stay the course. They met on March 25th and 26th. They received briefings from the generals and the intelligence analysts, and then they told Johnson something that this group of men, architects of containment, believers in American power, not doves, not protesters, not the kids in the street, had not told him before. They told him it could not be won. Johnson sat and listened. By multiple accounts of those present, he was visibly shaken in a way that was unusual for a man who had spent 40 years in politics and who had developed, across that career, a performer's capacity to show what a situation required rather than what he felt. He asked questions. He pushed back. He was told again. Something resolved in him in the days that followed. Or something broke. The two things are not always distinguishable. On the evening of March 31st, 1968, Johnson addressed the nation on television. The speech was about Vietnam, a partial bombing halt, an offer of negotiations. The speechwriters and the advisors had worked on it for days. But there was a passage at the end that almost none of them had seen, that Johnson had worked on separately, that he had discussed with almost no one except his wife Lady Bird and a small number of intimates. He told the country he would not seek and would not accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. The staff watching in the White House, people who had given years to this administration, who had not known this was coming, reacted in ways that observers described as ranging from disbelief to grief. His press secretary, George Christian, said later that he thought he had misheard. Johnson's approval rating in the days following went up. The country, exhausted and fractured, felt something like relief. He went back to his ranch in Texas, and he watched the year finish its destruction without him. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June, on the night of his California primary victory, which would almost certainly have made him the nominee. The Democratic Convention in Chicago in August became a televised catastrophe, with police beating demonstrators in the streets outside while the party tore itself apart inside. Richard Nixon won the presidency in November on a promise of a secret plan to end the war, which turned out not to exist. The war continued for 7 more years. Johnson died in January 1973 at his ranch of a heart attack, his third. He died the day before the Paris Peace Accords were signed, ending American involvement in Vietnam. He did not live to see it. His doctor said later that he had known for months that his heart was failing and had not followed the regimen that might have extended his life, that he had eaten and smoked in ways that suggested a man who had, at some level, stopped arguing with what was coming. He had asked during his presidency to be remembered for the Great Society, for the Civil Rights Act, for what he had built. History gave him Vietnam instead, which he had not wanted and could not escape, and could not end and could not win, and could not finally leave to someone else without leaving the presidency itself. The domestic legislation he passed between 1964 and 1966 transformed American life in ways that are still operative. Medicare covers tens of millions of Americans. The Voting Rights Act reshaped the political map. The education funding he secured changed what public schools could do. None of it is what the history chapters lead with. He knew it wouldn't be. He said so to people close to him in the last years. He knew what the verdict would be, and he knew he had earned part of it. And he knew the part he had earned was not the part he had wanted to earn, and he could not, in the end, find a way to make the accounting come out differently. That is not a unique condition among the powerful. It may be the most common one. The tragedy of Johnson is not that he was a villain. It is that he was large enough to do enormous good and enormous harm simultaneously, and that the capacity for both came from exactly the same place. The same ego, the same will, the same refusal to accept that there were things he could not force into the shape he needed them to take. He could browbeat a senator into a vote. He could not browbeat a war. The tapes ran. The names came every morning. He read them all.